So in this unit we're going to discuss the immediate post-war era in Europe. And let's first go back to May 9th, 1945. This is when the Soviet Union captures Berlin, and the war against Germany is by all means over at that point. And as you've read in A Woman in Berlin, you've got a sense of that scene, of what it was like, and the chaos of that scene. And at that point, there's a question as to what to do next. And there's a number of things on the agenda, immediate agenda. One, there is a desire to find the leading generals of the German army and capture them, or the German High Command, be that who they may. You probably know that Hitler committed suicide in Berlin before the war ends, in his bunker. And there are also a number of leading figures in the German High Command who follow that lead and commit suicide. Some will do it immediately, some will do it after they've been captured, using various means. Eventually, many of the High Command will be tried at what is known as the Nuremberg trials, which I'll discuss in a little bit. So that's one part of the agenda. The second part of the agenda is what's going to happen to Germany. There's this great fear in Europe from World War I that Germany was this aggressor nation. In World War II, Germany was this aggressor nation. How should it be dealt with after this war, so it'd be more successful in the future? And not much had been decided by the Allied powers. Stalin, Roosevelt had died, and Truman is now in power, and Winston Churchill. And they're afraid on both sides to make any commitments to anything. They want to kind of play it and see how it kind of works out. In May of 1949, the U.S. is still at war with Japan, and there's no end in sight for the war. Even though the U.S. had developed some atomic weaponry, they had not been used yet against an enemy nation, and there was not necessarily this great hope that this would somehow end the war. So we have a few months in between. We have this time period between May and August, before the first atomic bomb is dropped in August, as to how did the Allies deal with the Soviet Union. And it was Truman's decision to be more inclusive, to still stay on friendly terms with Stalin, because it was felt that it was necessary to have Russian troops in the Manchurian region of China. And so we stay friendly at that point, and the United States stays friendly with Russia, and promises are made concerning this. There was a conference earlier at Yalta before the war ended, and it was a conference in which the Poles today look back as basically the Allied powers signing away Poland's sovereignty. And so there's all these weird commitments that were kind of made during the war. There was secret agreements between Churchill and Stalin on a piece of paper that said who would have dominance in what areas, who would have a sphere of influence in certain areas. So although there's this grand idea that great powers politics is going to end after World War I, here we are again in World War II, and it's not going to end. The people on the ground are not included as to where the sphere of influence will be. And Western Europe is basically designated under the influence of the U.S. and the British, and Eastern Europe, depending where it was basically deemed a sphere of influence of the Soviet Union. We now look back in the Cold War and talk about how the Soviet Union dominated this region and all these things, but the way the Soviet Union saw it was that, look, Western Europe is going to be remade in the image of the systems of government from the U.S. and Britain, which is true. I mean, France is rebuilt as a democracy, and all of Western Europe become democratic nations. And the Russians saw, or the Soviets saw, it's only fair that on our side of Europe, on the eastern sphere of influence, we will make it in our own image. And eventually it's going to change into influence of communism. And you've read, again, some of this as well. And it depends on which nation as to how much their influence was and how it maintained later on. But generally by 1948, 3 years after the war, most of Eastern Europe is under the dominion of the Soviet Union. It's kind of like a colonial status. And again, I'll talk about that in a little bit. So when the war ends, we have this desire as to what's going to happen to Germany. Not much is decided. They just decide to make 4 spheres of influence. And they divide Germany into 4 parts. The Russian or Soviet part, the U.S. part, the British part, and the French part, which is, at least in my mind, just a gesture to the French, because the French were defeated in 1940, early on in the war. They collaborated with the Germans through most of the war, so it seems odd that we give them influence later on, but it's kind of, again, old world politics that France and Britain are at the lead, even though both were nations on the brink of collapse, economic collapse at the end of the war. So we have these movements happening. The third big thing that was on the agenda, the immediate thing that had to be dealt with, is the refugees. And the number of refugees crisscrossing Europe at this time is unlike has ever been seen on any continent, and at this level and at this time in such a short period of time. So there's various reasons. There's people all over the place. There are in Germany tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who were slave laborers from all parts of Eastern Europe, who are on the brink of starvation and have no means to get back to their homeland. Some of these people don't want to go back to their homeland because it has now been taken over by the Soviet Union. For example, in the Baltic states, remember the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had divided Eastern Europe between German halves and Russian halves. And Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania don't regain their independence after the war. They're independent from 1920 or so to 1939. War's over. No, they're now part of the Soviet Union. And this is something that the U.S. won't recognize as being fair, but it's not willing to fight against it either. So there are those people who were slave laborers who are in Germany, and they don't want to go back. And what are we going to do with these people? We have concentration camp survivors throughout Germany and Austria. Some of them afraid to go back to their homelands because of what had happened, of course, and wanting to emigrate to another country possibly with very few open doors. So you have people who really are on the brink of starvation and are dying by the thousands in the first few days, first few months after their liberation. We'll talk again about this issue. There's a refugee crisis of those who have lost their homes throughout, especially Eastern Europe, where there's a lot of bombing of major cities. Budapest was under siege the last 100 or so days when their involvement in the war knocked out every single bridge that crosses the Danube. So like this city was divided in half by the river, and there's no means to cross it except by small boat. There's Berlin, as you know, is in chaos. And there's bombed out cities all over Germany, and Warsaw basically burned to the ground practically. So there's an immediate crisis, and the only nation who has the money to make any quick changes or to solve any of these problems is really the U.S. And the Soviet Union has certain means as well, but they're not interested in the humanitarian crisis at all. Again, we'll talk about what happens.